Before the lawns were smoothed, before the paths curved just so, before New York learned to call this space natural, there was a village here. Not a metaphor, not a rumor beneath the trees. A place with boundaries, with deeds filed at City Hall, with children walking to school past stone walls and vegetable plots. With men whose right to vote existed only because the ground beneath their feet belonged to them. Stand in Central Park today and everything is designed to feel inevitable. The rock outcrops look ancient. The clearings feel accidental. The silence suggests permanence. But this landscape was not discovered. It was made, and before it could be made, something else had to be undone. In the mid-19th century, as New York accelerated toward wealth and scale, a small community took root on land no one else wanted. High ground, rocky soil far from the city's center. For some, distance meant exclusion. For others, it meant possibility. They built slowly. They stayed. They buried their dead. They organized churches and schools. They bought land when ownership itself was a form of resistance. Then the city looked north. What followed was not a riot, not a single night of fire or collapse. It was quieter than that. Legal, incremental, carried out with paperwork, appraisals, editorials, and police batons used in the name of order. When the park opened, the village was already gone. Its houses dismantled, its cemeteries disturbed, its people scattered beyond the map. The grass grew in and memory did not. This is not a story about a park. It is a story about what cities decide to remember and what they choose to build over. Beneath one of the most visited landscapes on Earth, the ground still holds the outline of a different New York, a place that existed long enough to matter and briefly enough to disappear. Why this land mattered and who claimed it? The northern edge of Manhattan in the 1820s was not empty. It was simply inconvenient. The city ended miles south. Roads dissolved into dirt. Bedrock pushed through the soil in sharp angles. Streams surfaced where planners would later prefer straight lines. To speculators, this land was marginal. To people with limited options, it was something else entirely. In 1825, John and Elizabeth Whitehead began selling pieces of their farmland along this rough terrain, lots carved out between what would one day be 82 and 89 streets. The ground was uneven, but it was dry, elevated, less prone to disease than the crowded wards below. Canal Street, far enough from the city's hostility to offer a measure of autonomy. The first buyers arrived without ceremony. Andrew Williams was 25. A shoe shiner? He bought 3 lots for $125. Money, accumulated slowly, publicly, in a city that watched black earnings with suspicion. Epiphany Davis followed the same day, purchasing 12 lots. He worked as a store clerk. He was a trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. He understood that land was not just shelter. It was leverage. Within days, the church itself purchased 6 lots. This was not improvisation. It was coordination. Property ownership for free. Black New Yorkers carried a weight that did not apply to anyone else. Under state law, the right to vote required not just residency, but real estate, $250 worth. Without land, political voice did not exist. Without permanence, neither did protection. So they chose permanence. Houses rose slowly, built with what materials could be afforded. Wood frames, stone foundations cut into the hill, gardens pressed into shallow soil, livestock kept close, water drawn from a spring that surfaced reliably, even in dry months. The land dictated the rhythm. The village adapted. It took shape not as a grid, but as a system. Paths bending around rock, homes clustered where the ground allowed, space left for burial and worship. From the heights of what was then called Goat Hill, the Hudson River was visible in the distance. The city, when it could be seen at all, felt far away. What formed here was not temporary housing. Census records decades later would show families staying for 20 years or more. Children born here grew up here. People aged in place. Stability in a city that denied it to so many became the village's defining feature. By the time the settlement had a name, Seneca Village, it already had something. Rarer continuity. And that continuity began with a decision that seemed small at the time. To buy land no one else wanted. To place roots where the city had not yet decided what the future would look like. For now, the ground was quiet. and the quiet felt like safety. Ownership is a power in city designed to withhold it. Land in Seneca Village was never just about shelter. It was about being counted. New York in the early 19th century measured citizenship selectively. For white men, the franchise had loosened over time. For black men, it had tightened. The state constitution of 1821 did not simply restrict the vote, it translated political existence into property value, $250 in real estate, proof of permanence, proof of discipline, proof implicitly of acceptability. In the city at large, that threshold was nearly unreachable. Wages were low, discrimination was structural, renting was common, ownership was rare. Among black New Yorkers, property holders formed a narrow, fragile class, visible, vulnerable, and carefully watched. Seneca Village changed that equation. By the 1850s, roughly half of the black residents here owned the ground beneath their homes. That figure stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, where ownership of any kind was the exception, not the rule. This was not accidental. The land was cheaper. The location was dismissed. The risks were environmental, not legal, and for men who understood the arithmetic of rights, it was worth it. 10 of the city's eligible black voters lived here. 10 names in poll books that represented something larger than a number. Each vote required documentation. Each ballot cast was backed by a deed. The village did not merely exist within the city. It asserted itself against the city's rules. This political visibility shaped how the settlement functioned. Property boundaries mattered. Taxes were paid. Census enumerators returned to the same households decade after decade. Children were registered. Deaths recorded. The village appeared repeatedly in the city's own paperwork, even as it remained absent from its imagination. Life here was working class, and it was demanding. Men labored as cartmen, porters, waiters, shoe shiners. Their work carried them daily into white neighborhoods where their permanence was tolerated only temporarily. Women cleaned homes, cooked meals, raised other people's children, then returned north to a community that was their own. The land absorbed the rest of life. Gardens filled in where rock allowed soil to settle. Chickens and pigs were kept close. Fishing supplemented wages when possible. Tanner's Spring, reliable, clean, became a shared dependency. It did not belong to any single household, but everyone relied on it. The village was built on these small, mutual understandings. Churches anchored the social order. The African Union Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Congregation, later All Angels Church, deliberately integrated in a city that was not. These were not symbolic institutions. They were administrative centers, places where disputes were mediated, funds collected, schools housed, burial grounds maintained. Education followed. Children attended classes in church basements. Literacy was practical, not abstract. Reading contracts, reading notices, reading the language of a city that rarely spoke to them directly. Stability accumulated slowly, but it was visible. Families remained, houses improved, property lines hardened. This was not transient labor housing. It was a settlement with memory. And memory carried risk, because land that proves durable eventually attracts attention. As the city pushed northward, maps began to change. What had once been considered remote became merely inconvenient. What had been dismissed as rocky became suddenly elevated. Health reformers spoke of fresh air. Planners spoke of order. Newspapers began to imagine a city remade. In these conversations, Seneca Village was not invited to participate. It appeared instead as a problem to be solved, a presence to be redefined, a fact on the ground that complicated a vision taking shape elsewhere. For now, the village still stood. Deeds were valid. Votes were cast. The ground remained legally owned. But ownership in a city built on ambition had always been conditional. And the condition was about to change. Daily life labor, institutions, and belonging. From a distance, Seneca Village did not announce itself. There was no skyline, no uniformity, no symmetry that a planner would later recognize as intentional. The houses followed the land. Paths curved around stone. Fences ended where bedrock refused to yield. To an outsider passing through, it could appear unfinished. To the people who lived here, it was complete. Mornings began with work that took residents away from the village and into the city below. Men walked south to stables, hotels, warehouses. Women followed narrower routes into kitchens and laundry rooms. The village emptied at dawn and refilled at dusk, carrying the residue of the city with it. News, money, exhaustion, tension. What remained during the day were children, elders, gardens, and the land itself. The village functioned as an interdependent system. Food did not arrive fully formed from markets. It was supplemented, stretched, managed. Small plots produced vegetables. Livestock was tended carefully, aware of limited space. Waste was handled locally. Water drawn collectively. This was not rural life transplanted into the city. It was adaptation under constraint. Church bells structured time. Sundays were visible from a distance, movement converging rather than dispersing. 3 congregations, each distinct, each necessary. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church formalized a presence long established. The African Union Church represented autonomy and continuity. All Angels Church, integrated by design, stood as a quiet challenge to the city's segregated norms without, announcing itself as protest. Burial grounds lay close. Death was not outsourced to distant cemeteries. The dead remained within the geography of daily life, marking time in a way the city preferred to forget. Education did not stop at childhood. Schools operated out of church basements, but learning extended into the home. Literacy was reinforced by necessity. Letters, receipts, notices posted by the city. Parents who had fought for land understood the stakes of comprehension. Ignorance carried penalties. The village's stability showed in the census. Families appeared again and again, unchanged addresses, consistent occupations. Average residency stretched over 2 decades. In a city defined by churn, this stillness was unusual, and it was noticed. Irish immigrants began settling alongside Black residents, drawn by the same conditions: affordability, distance, opportunity. They arrived with their own precariousness, their own exclusion from the city's center. The village absorbed them without redefinition. Ethnicity did not erase class. Work tied them together more tightly than origin separated them. This mixture unsettled outside observers. It defied easy categorization. The village was neither purely Black nor purely immigrant, neither rural nor urban, neither temporary nor sanctioned by design. It existed in the margins between classifications. That ambiguity made it vulnerable. City officials preferred clarity. Reformers preferred categories. Journalists preferred labels that could be explained quickly to readers who would never visit the site themselves. Seneca Village resisted all of it by simply continuing to function. What could not be dismissed as transient could still be reframed. Descriptions began to circulate, informal at first, then more deliberate. Words like rough, irregular, unplanned. These were not accusations yet. They were preparations. The village did not respond. It had no reason to. Life continued at its established pace. Gardens were planted, church funds collected, property taxes paid. From within, nothing felt unstable. But beyond its boundaries, the city was changing how it talked about land. And when language shifts, consequences follow. The city's appetite grows. The park becomes necessary. By the 1840s, New York had begun to feel the pressure of its own success. The streets below 14th Street thickened with people and refuse. Summer heat settled between buildings. Disease followed density. Cholera returned in waves, indifferent to wealth but amplified by it. Reformers searched for solutions that did not require dismantling the systems producing the problem. They found one in distance. European cities offered a model: large, controlled landscapes set aside from commerce and residence. Parks as lungs, parks as order imposed on growth. Parks as evidence that a city could be both powerful and humane. New York did not yet have such a space. Advocates began to speak of necessity, not desire. A park was no longer a luxury for elites. It was framed as infrastructure. Public health, moral improvement, civic identity. The language carried urgency and with it authority. Attention turned north. Maps were unrolled in committee rooms. Topographical features that had once been obstacles were reinterpreted as assets. Rock outcrops became picturesque. Elevation became healthful. Streams became design elements. What had discouraged settlement now justified transformation. The proposed site stretched from 59th Street to 106th, 750 acres. Farms, institutions, small settlements, none of it invisible, but all of it negotiable. Within this expanse sat Seneca Village, In official discussions, it appeared briefly, if at all. When it did, it was not as a community, but as an inconvenience. Something already there. Something to be resolved. The Central Park Act passed in 1853. Its language was precise. The land would be acquired for public use. Compensation would be provided. Authority would rest with a commission empowered to reshape the terrain as needed. This was not framed as destruction. It was framed as improvement. Newspapers amplified the vision. Engravings circulated showing open lawns, promenades, orderly crowds. The park existed first as an image, a future so persuasive that anything occupying the space in the present felt temporary by comparison. Descriptions of existing settlements hardened. Where ambiguity had existed, judgment followed. Seneca Village was increasingly referred to as a shantytown, its residents as squatters, despite recorded deeds, its houses as hovels, despite stone foundations and tax records. Language did the work that law would later formalize. The village did not vanish overnight. Years passed between authorization and enforcement. During that time, the park grew more real on paper, while the community beneath it became less so in public discourse. Residents heard rumors. They read notices. They saw surveyors. Stakes driven into the ground carried meanings that did not need explanation. Still, life continued. What else could it do? The law had not yet arrived at their doors. Deeds were still valid. Taxes still due. The city asked them to behave as permanent residents while preparing to treat them as removable obstacles. When condemnation finally came, it arrived as paperwork. In 1855, the land was officially taken. Eminent domain translated vision into force. Appraisers assessed value. Compensation was calculated according to formulas that rarely captured what was being lost. Some residents contested the numbers. They filed appeals. They argued correctly that their property had been undervalued. A few succeeded in raising their payments slightly. None succeeded in staying. The park had become inevitable. And inevitability has a way of hollowing out everything beneath it, long before the ground is cleared. Language as a weapon. Shantytown, squatters, erasure. Before the buildings came down, the language did its work. Once the decision had been made, Seneca Village needed to become something the public would accept losing. Not formally, there was no vote on its existence, but culturally, the city required a story that explained why removal was not only permissible, but beneficial. Newspapers supplied it. Descriptions hardened into caricature. The village was no longer a place of residence. It was a condition, disorder, idleness, moral risk. Its inhabitants were recast as temporary occupants, regardless of deeds filed decades earlier. Stability was reinterpreted as stagnation. The term shantytown appeared with increasing confidence. It did not describe construction methods. It described worth. Once applied, it erased nuance. It did not pay taxes, did not need churches, did not need cemeteries. It did not vote. It simply occupied space that could be better used. This framing mattered because the park was being sold as a moral project, an environment meant to elevate behavior, provide respite, and impose order on a city growing too quickly for its own structures to manage. Disorder within the proposed boundaries threatened the coherence of that vision. So disorder was assigned. The fact that Seneca Village contained property owners, particularly Black property owners, complicated the narrative. Ownership implied legitimacy. Legitimacy demanded negotiation. Negotiation slowed progress. Language removed the need. Official reports rarely engaged the village directly. When they did, they spoke abstractly. Numbers without names, buildings without occupants. The community was reduced to a feature of the landscape, like a marsh or quarry, to be drained or filled. This erasure was not accidental. It aligned with a broader pattern in American urban development, where communities rendered illegible could be displaced, with minimal resistance from the public. What could not be seen clearly did not require protection. Inside the village, the effect was disorienting. Residents encountered their own reflection distorted in print. They read accounts that bore little resemblance to daily life. Their homes were described as temporary, their presence as accidental, their removal as corrective. There was no public forum where these portrayals could be contested at scale. Court challenges focused narrowly on compensation, not legitimacy. The question was no longer whether the village should exist, but how much it was worth to erase it. And even that question was constrained. Assessments emphasized structure over system. A house was valued, a fence a plot of land, but churches were more than buildings, cemeteries more than parcels. Voting rights derived from ownership were not compensable at all. What could not be measured was dismissed. As the language spread, resistance became easier to suppress. Police presence increased. Notices were enforced with greater confidence. The narrative had prepared the ground for force by framing it as maintenance of order rather than removal of people. By the time evictions accelerated, the village had already been culturally vacated. The park existed in the public imagination as an absence waiting to be filled. What stood in the way was no longer seen as a community, but as a delay. And delays in a city rushing toward its future are rarely tolerated for long. Condemnation, resistance, and forced removal. Condemnation did not arrive as a single moment. It settled in. By 1855, the legal status of Seneca Village had shifted decisively. The land was no longer held for the future of the people who lived on it. It was held in trust for a design that had not yet touched the ground. Ownership persisted only long enough to be converted into compensation. Notices came first, then deadlines, then enforcement. Residents were required to leave by the end of 1857. On paper, the timeline appeared generous. In practice, it suspended life. Improvements no longer made sense. Repairs were postponed. Gardens were planted knowing they would not be harvested. Institutions operated without a future to plan toward. The village entered a state of waiting. Some families left early, relocating where they could, south into the city, east across the river, north into less certain territory. Others stayed. Not out of denial, but out of calculation. Land elsewhere was scarce. Rents were high. Ownership, once surrendered, was nearly impossible to regain. Remaining meant preserving leverage for as long as possible. Residents challenged valuations in court. They argued the appraisals underestimated the worth of their property. In some cases, they succeeded. Payments were adjusted upward, marginally. The process was technical, constrained, exhausting, but these appeals acknowledged only value, not belonging. As deadlines passed, the city's patience thinned. What had once been administrative became physical. Police were dispatched to enforce removal. The law was no longer an abstraction. It wore uniforms and carried batons. Newspaper accounts recorded the moment with a tone of satisfaction. One described the supremacy of the law being upheld through force. The phrase was telling. The conflict was framed not as eviction, but as restoration of order. Resistance, however limited, was treated as defiance rather than survival. Families were removed. Belongings carried out or left behind. Churches that had anchored the community were closed, then dismantled. Cemeteries, quiet, immovable, were seized along with everything else. By August of 1857, the village was effectively empty. What followed was not relocation but dispersal. No coordinated resettlement, no acknowledgement of communal loss. The people of Seneca Village did not move together. They vanished into the city's margins, into other settlements, into records that no longer tracked them as a group. The destruction of the village severed more than housing. It dissolved networks that had taken decades to form. Churches lost congregations. Schools lost students. Political power, derived from land ownership, evaporated immediately. The city absorbed the space. It did not absorb the people. Within months, demolition crews moved in. Buildings were razed, foundations broken, debris buried. The ground was reshaped to match drawings, produced years earlier in offices far removed from the site. Erasure was thorough, but not hurried. It unfolded with the confidence of a project that believed itself justified. When the landscape work began, there were no houses left to contradict it. Only soil, and beneath it the quiet evidence of lives interrupted, not by disaster but by decision, physical destruction and landscape forgetting. The removal of Seneca Village did not leave a void. It left material, stone from foundations, broken brick, household refuse, the residue of decades compressed into the soil. Before any tree was planted or path laid, this debris had to be dealt with, not removed entirely but subdued. Park construction did not erase the past. It buried it. Crews leveled what remained. Cellars were filled, wells sealed. The ground was graded to produce the illusion of untouched terrain. Artificial contours softened the scars of demolition. Where the land resisted, it was reshaped. Where it yielded, it was covered. The transformation was deliberate. Central Park was designed to feel discovered, not imposed. The landscape architecture relied on concealment as much as composition. The more natural it appeared, the less visible the labor and the loss beneath it. Church sites disappeared first. Burial grounds followed. The cemeteries of Seneca Village were seized along with everything else. The formal process of disinterment is poorly documented. What is known is what did not happen. There was no preserved memorial space, no integration of the dead into the new design. The village's graves were not meant to be encountered. They were meant to be forgotten. Paths curved over former property lines. Lawns covered cellar floors. Summit Rock, once a point of orientation within the village, was rebranded as a scenic feature. Tanner's Spring remained, but its function shifted from survival to ornament. The park opened to the public as a triumph of civic will. Visitors praised its beauty, its scale, its order. The narrative held. New York had given itself a gift. What had been lost did not feature in the celebration. As years passed, memory thinned. Seneca Village did not reappear in guidebooks. It did not linger in popular histories. The city's story moved forward, and the village receded into footnotes, then into absence. By the 20th century, there was nothing above ground to suggest it had ever existed. What remained were fragments, sealed away and undisturbed by design. A child's shoe sole pressed into earth, ceramic shards from imported porcelain, buttons, pipes, bones, objects too ordinary to matter until nothing else survived. When archaeologists returned to the site in the early 21st century, they did not uncover ruins. They uncovered interruption. Foundation walls cut short, cellars filled abruptly, deposits frozen in time not by disaster but by decree. The artifacts spoke quietly of domestic life. Tea kettles, toothbrushes, food remains, evidence of care, of routine, of intention. These were not the remnants of a slum. They were the remains of a functioning community, stopped mid-sentence. Today nothing marks the village unless you know where to look. A plaque, temporary signage, names without structures, memory without geography. The park continues to do its work. Millions pass through each year, unaware that the calm they experience was built on displacement, rendered invisible by design. Silence once landscaped is difficult to undo, but it is never complete. What remained beneath the grass, and what does not return? Central Park is often described as timeless. Its paths feel settled. Its trees seem older than the city that surrounds them. The design encourages the belief that this landscape has always been here, waiting to be recognized. That belief is the park's greatest success and its deepest distortion. Time did not stop here. It was redirected. The people of Seneca Village did not leave a legacy that could be easily traced. There were no institutions left standing to evolve. No district name preserved on maps. No neighborhood to return to once conditions changed. Displacement without documentation dissolves into anonymity. Some former residents may have moved to other Black communities on the region's edges, places like Sandy Ground on Staten Island or Skunk Hollow in New Jersey. Others likely remained in the city, absorbed into overcrowded districts where ownership was no longer possible. Their trajectories, once communal, became individual and largely unrecorded. What was lost cannot be measured only in homes or land value. For Black men in Seneca Village, property had translated directly into political presence. When the land was taken, the vote disappeared with it. A small but meaningful concentration of enfranchised citizens was eliminated without legislation, without debate, without acknowledgement. The city did not need to strip rights explicitly. It only needed to rearrange the ground. The park endures as a public good. It delivers what it promised: space, air, respite, beauty. These facts are not in question. What remains unresolved is the cost of that achievement, and how selectively that cost was assigned. Seneca Village fits a pattern that repeats quietly across American cities. Communities rendered peripheral become expendable once their land gains value. The justification shifts: health, progress, renewal, but the mechanism remains familiar. Ownership becomes temporary when it conflicts with ambition. Unlike riots or fires, this kind of loss leaves no dramatic ruins. It leaves landscapes that function perfectly. That is why it persists. Archaeology returned Seneca Village briefly to view. But archaeology is not restoration. It recovers fragments, not futures. The foundations remain buried. The paths remain fixed. The park does not change its shape to accommodate what it replaced. and yet the ground remembers. Summit Rock still rises where homes once oriented themselves. Tanner's Spring still surfaces where water was once gathered out of necessity. The natural features that made the land livable remain, even as the lives that depended on them have been erased from the surface. Standing there now, nothing demands recognition. The park does not interrupt itself to tell this story. It does not need to. The absence is complete enough to feel intentional. Seneca Village does not ask to be rebuilt. It does not offer a lesson packaged for comfort. It exists as a record of how easily permanence can be reclassified as provisional, how progress can proceed without accounting for who it displaces, and how silence can be engineered as carefully as beauty. The city moved on. The land stayed. And beneath the grass, the outline of another New York remains, unfinished, undocumented, and unwilling to disappear entirely.